So without further ado, the title of tonight's panel is Abolition and the Left. Following the 2020 George Floyd protests, police and prison abolition became major demands on the left. Yet, 2 years later, though the movement for abolition has seemingly waned, police and prisons remain. Why do police and prisons exist? How do police and prisons relate to capitalism historically? What kind of politics would be required to abolish police and prisons today? Following the 2020 George Floyd protests, police and prison abolition became major demands on the left. Yet, 2 years later, though the movement for abolition has seemingly waned, police and prisons remain. Why do police and prisons exist? How do police and prisons relate to capitalism historically? What kind of politics would be required to abolish police and prisons today? What was the potential of the George Floyd protests, and what lessons have been learned since? What is the role of the left in police and prison abolition? And now to introduce our panelists in the order that they will be speaking. Timmy Chao is Managing Director at the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Education Project. Andy Thayer is the co-founder of the Chicago Coalition Against War and Racism and the Gay Liberation Network, which takes an intersectional approach to organizing, including supporting abortion rights, anti-racist organizing, immigrant rights, and pro-Palestinian and anti-war activism. He has helped organize many large protests in Chicago and is a part of the Gay Liberation Network's internationalist activism. He has been arrested at LGBT rights demonstrations in Moscow, Russia, and participated in solidarity delegations to Honduras. Naomi Crane is the Socialist Workers' Party candidate for governor of Illinois. She is a freight rail conductor and member of the SMART TD union. CJ is the Standing Practical Work Officer at the Chicago Workers' School, a newly independent political education group established in Chicago last September as the local for the Center for Political Innovation. The organization seeks to make more common the holistic Marxist-Leninist worldview in preparation for a viable party that will eventually emerge to lead the working class in this country. It seeks to promote Marxism-Leninism not as a dogma, but as the most historically effective branch of Marxism, yet one that we should aspire to transcend on our way to creating the revolutionary theory called for by our conditions here and now. The Workers' School operates through in-person and online reading groups, socials, and various forms of outreach. The organization numbers around 15 members presently. So each panelist will have 8 to 10 minutes for opening remarks and then 3 to 4 minutes to respond to one another. When you have 5 minutes left, 1 minute left, and no time left, I will signal to indicate your time remaining. After you all respond to each other, we will move on to audience Q&A. So please go ahead with your opening remarks. Timmy.
Would it be possible to start with somebody else?
Yeah, Andy?
Yeah. The first thing I'd like to say is that, to its eternal credit, the Black Lives Matter raised the issues of what to do about the state and its core components, the police and the prisons, on a mass scale for the first time in over a generation. And that's something that we all owe an enormous debt to. But these questions were not original to the Black Lives Matter movement. Actually, if you go back to Marx talking about the Paris Commune of 1871, he first talked about the need to abolish the state. What is the core of the state? And not incoincidentally, Lenin talked about the same issues in August 1917, both in reference to the revolutionary situation in Russia following the overthrow of the Tsar. It's not an accident that those two earlier thinkers began formulating their ideas about the state, perfecting them, if you will, in relationship to these revolutionary events. And basically, to put it in, shall we say, crude terms, the state is a necessary vehicle of class rule. At the core of the state is the police, the prisons. This is the mechanism by which inequality is maintained and augmented, and it's no accident that policing in black and working class neighborhoods takes on a very different flavor than in Streeterville or what have you. That the role of the state, the idea that you can get rid of the nasty aspects of the state is frankly utopian. Now, I participated in a number of demonstrations organized by Black Lives Matter activists. I can't claim to be an expert on some of the leading thinkers, Miriam Kaba and others, who were really the intellectual core of that movement. But nonetheless, the idea of abolishing the police, abolishing prisons was popularized by that movement. And that popularization sometimes took the form of we need to have a revolution in this country to overthrow capitalism in the state. And in other aspects, sometimes it made it sound like, well, we can get rid of the nasty aspects of the state this side of capitalism. I don't think that the leading thinkers in the BLM movement, the people that the core activists really looked to, thought that. But it was understandable that there was that ambiguity, the notion that we are going to get rid of the Chicago Police Department this side of capitalism by totally defunding it is frankly utopia. But it was so important to have that conversation initiated because in this city, the police per capita ratio versus civilians is the third highest in the United States of any city over 50,000 people. And that's 650 cities, and we're number 3. And anyone who's lived in this town as long as I have will tell you that every single damn mayoral candidate will say they're going to hire more police, which is how we got to that awful situation. And obviously, we've got a huge problem, not just with communal violence, but police violence. And that's another discussion. But it's as Marx as well as Lenin and Engels put it, the state arises as a result of irreconcilable class contradictions. And the core of the state are the armed bodies of men to enforce that inequality. One thing I think it's important to point out is that much of the left has never agreed with these questions even being raised by the BLM movement. Probably the biggest movement that we saw on the left in the past few years, aside from the Black Lives Matter movement, was the Bernie Sanders movement, which spread mightily the whole idea that you can take control of the existing state or one of its political parties and use that political party to take control of the state and somehow turn the state into something nice and warm and fuzzy. Well, anyone that looks around the world and the history of the United States, this government has never flinched from overthrowing other governments around the world at the slightest quote-unquote provocation, invaded them and so forth. So this whole notion that you could take over one of their parties and then in turn take over the state was a real disservice, frankly, to building a revolutionary movement. That said, I think it's important to say that things can be won versus this awful state. As we've seen in some of the reforms, the ending a cash bail and so forth that are under mighty assault right now in the state of Illinois, that we shouldn't just say, oh, well, we can't get rid of the police this side of capitalism. We can certainly defund them considerably, consider that they represent some 40% of the city of Chicago's operational budget. That there are reforms that can be won, but we shouldn't have any illusions that this is somehow going to turn the state and its police into some warm and fuzzy creature. Now, one of the phrases, reading State and Revolution, which is really a primer on this, I can't recommend it enough. I flipped back at the moment I was invited to do this panel because it raises the questions in very clear form. one of the things that Lenin says in that is that so-called democracy is the optimal political form for capitalism, because it's far easier to persuade people to follow their roles in capitalism, producing wealth and so forth. It's a far easier way to rule than it is to use blunt force. Get people to believe somewhat in the fact that the current system is legitimate. It's a lot harder to do that when your police are repeatedly cracking heads. But unfortunately, that breeds lots of illusions in the left, as we said with the Bernie Sanders movement. So I think I'm probably going to leave it there and respond to my co-panelists and other people in the room. But again, these are not new issues. The breath of fresh air is the BLM movement raised them in a way that brought down on them the wrath of the Democratic and Republican parties. And if nothing tells you that you're doing the right thing, it's when they both hate you that much. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. Timmy, if you're ready.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Timmy. My pronouns are he, him, his. So yeah, in my day-to-day capacity, I'm director of the Prison and Neighborhood Arts and Education Project. We run rad political arts and educational programming inside Stateville Maximum Security Men's Prison, and then as well as in Logan Prison, which is a women's prison in more southwest of the city. I'm also, I didn't share my bio in time, but I also co-founded an organization called Dissenters, which is a youth-led anti-war organization that launched in 2020, and now is student chapter-based, and right now we have about 26 chapters across the country, including on Hawaii, and yeah, so I helped start that, and so some introductory comments, just based on the kind of guiding questions that we were offered. To the first question of just like, what are the prison and police in relation to racial capitalism? For me, as a young person who was politicized during the BLM movement around like 2013, 2014, the abolition was the kind of hegemonic frame for a lot of young folks who were being politicized, particularly around issues of police brutality and mass incarceration, right? And so as I developed an understanding and a lens of like what that means in more detail, what it meant to different people, for me, abolition really is recognizing, that the prison, the function of the state, specifically the role that the prison and police play in basically being the hands and arms of the state and capital, and disappearing surplus populations, and not just disappearing and disposing of folks, but also being the arm of like domination and extra violence upon communities that has been deemed disposable and less than human, and specifically in the context of the U.S. And so abolition, and I don't need to, y'all already touched on this, but the state, maintains the status quo. It's the mediator of maintain the status quo of class relations and all that, right? And so it's, abolition for me is really a vision and a direction and a guide map to working toward a stateless, classless society, if you will, and kind of political program and vision to try to get us there, right? I think it also, for me as an organizer, is a really clearly like strategic frame to focus in on a target that unites many impacted communities that have been impacted and are currently being, feeling the brunt of capital in the state, the violence of state, by focusing on trying to chip away and make less powerful institutions that are, the dominant institutions that are impacting people's lives, right? So you have folks in the abolitionist movement that are working, on targeting the carceral state, policing, ICE detention facilities, all the kind of mechanisms of state violence that are essentially, the tools of the ruling elites that are, that they're being used to kind of deal with folks that have just been, slipped through the cracks of the economy and all that. So for me, it's like, a strategic kind of lens to organize toward, changing material conditions of our lives, right? I think another important piece of why abolition, I saw the flyer, it's like abolition and the left question mark. For me, my response is duh, yes. Because two, why it also is really strategic is because it is through the work of many of like the abolition leaders who have popularized that kind of framework. It's not just like a strategic plan to like transform material conditions, but also is getting at the insidious cultural, ideological foundation that enables the U.S. state and capital relations, specifically because it's forcing through transformative justice, restorative justice, all these kind of cultural, frames and relational frameworks, forcing us to ask questions of how we deal with harm, right? And who is deserving of access to life-affirming resources and the social wage and all these things, right? And it's forcing us to ask those questions to counter the carceral, punitive, disposability culture that is like also, connected to U.S. military empire culture of violence, militarism, disposing of less than others, right? And asking us to challenge those dominant ideologies. 5 minutes or? Okay. And to give an example of that is, a lot of my comrades are locked up inside dealing with life sentences, right? And many of them who are now like I strategize and collaborate on around mostly issues of like sentencing, long-term sentencing and stuff like that. For abolition represents an opportunity to actually shift and change the, dominant state structures that have totally rendered so many populations which disposable and thrown away, right? Because it is a chance, the principles and values that undergird abolition, that kind of it begs the question to, really, force us to also transform the cultural, values that also enable the racial capitalist status quo in the U.S. One thing I'll say also about abolition is it's a multi-tendency. It's a massive movement, and there's multiple tendencies within abolition, right? There's what I would say are like revolutionary abolitionists who are, believe in who, in the context of the U.S., believe that the United States state apparatus must be totally demolished, right, and tear down completely. There's other tendencies. There's folks that believe in, not the whole state, but other parts of the state are redeemable and have served useful functions for society. There's more liberal factions within the abolitionist movement, I would argue, where you get the folks that are more doing legal abolitionist reform work, and what have you. So I think when we talk about the abolitionist movement, it's a vast movement, and we got to be real specific about who we're talking to and the ideologies and tendencies and practices within that. And then there's a question here about George, what can we learn about George Floyd? And I'm assuming I can kind of respond to that question too. Yeah. What can we learn from the George Floyd uprisings and rebellions? Well, I think what it demonstrated for me was just how weak the left is in the U.S., right? I mean, we had days and weeks of sustained militant uprisings and insurrections across the state, right? And for me, part of the role of the left is to, facilitate and support and push those demands further, right? And build the capacity and networks and resources that can sustain kind of revolutionary ruptures for as long as possible. And then also the role of the left for me is also to like translate that into the most radical political demands that we can demand and wrench out of the political decision makers wherever you are. And I think what it demonstrated is you had cities that were like ready to disband their entire police force within a week. Activists and nonprofits came in, and those demands shifted very quickly and turned into more legislative demands, right? And then all of a sudden, once those revolutionary ruptures kind of closed up, the status quo hopped back in, and wins were like, budgets were being like, it was not a non-question again about cutting budgets and stuff like that. So I think for me it was like just how baby the left is in the US and how we have a long way to go to be able to like really make the most of when these conditions like combust and push them as far as possible. And then I think just the growing non-profitization of just kind of social change work in the U.S. It's unique, at least in my experience. I need to do more international like travel and stuff to understand the role of like NGOs and nonprofits everywhere, but the way that it does defang and water down and kind of co-opt these moments and ruptures was abundantly clear in the wake of the George Floyd uprising. So those are some thoughts.
Thank you. Naomi?
Okay. Well, the Socialist Workers' Party is building a party of the working class, not the left. We start with the crises that are caused by the dictatorship of capital that we live under, which is not just the economic things, the inflation, wages that don't keep up with it, but also the moral and social crises. The breakdown of the family and of solidarity, the growing rates of suicide, drug and gambling addiction, mental illness, the wars that capitalism inevitably produces. And we start from the fact that the only road out is the working class and other exploited classes taking power. There's no way to reform capitalism. To realize our potential, workers need to throw off the self-image that the rulers and their lackeys promote among us, that we can't do anything. We need to see that the working class is the progressive class in society, the force that's capable of building a society that's based on solidarity and not a dog-eat-dog race for profits. Frederick Engels in 1847 said, communism is not a doctrine but a movement. It proceeds not from principles but from facts. In other words, it's not a set of ideas and ideology. It's the line of march of a class, the working class, towards political power. The massive protests that we saw following the death of George Floyd reflected the widespread anger over police brutality and racism among working people of all skin colors. I think especially significant was the scope of these protests, not just in the cities, but in small towns across the country. There are many workers and young people that took to the streets for the first time in their lives. These protests, however, were quickly undercut by those who carried out looting and burning stores and so on. There was a whole layer of anarchists and some elements within the Black Lives Matter organizations that organized or justified these kind of anti-working class actions. And there was a layer that increasingly promoted race baiting. That is saying, okay, there's systemic racism and the problem is white people, not the problem is capitalism. The system is capitalism. At the same time, the protests were channeled by liberals and much of the left into various types of reformism, in the form of, well, we need to, elect the Democrats as they're the lesser evil, although the Democrats are the largest party of imperialism in the world today. And also through reformist slogans like defund the police or even abolish the police. The role of the cops and prisons in capitalist society is to protect and serve the interests of the ruling class. the capitalist state's laws and the way they're enforced are designed to keep workers in line and to brand a substantial layer of us as criminals, particularly those who are black or from other oppressed nationalities. At the same time, and this is of great concern to workers, capitalist society produces antisocial violence within working class communities. In addition to the immediate consequences, this breeds fear and demoralization in the working class. It saps our confidence and tears at social solidarity, which in turn feeds more antisocial behavior and spreads the infection of the kind of dog-eat-dog morality of capitalism, which comes straight from the top. Workers live in the real world with its contradictions. Campaigning in neighborhoods, I can't tell you how many people have told me about, they don't like the cops. They'll tell you all kinds of stories of themselves being profiled, facing abuse from the cops, and at the same time don't support the idea of defunding the police or abolishing prisons because they know that it is better to live under the capitalist rule of law than what the immediate alternative, if you just got rid of it today, would be, which is the rule of gangs and vigilantes. The Socialist Workers' Party joins in fights against police brutality, frame-ups, abusive prison conditions, and the death penalty. We work to build support for these fights in the labor movement, which is important. It's part of building working class solidarity on the broadest level. But we have no illusions that the fundamental character of the bourgeois so-called justice can be reformed. The Cuban Revolution provides an example of what is the road forward. When workers and peasants took power there in 1959, they didn't try and reform the henchmen of the Batista dictatorship. Nor did they drag them through the streets and lynch them. They said, there's not going to be any, we're not having vengeance, which is important because of what that does to your solidarity, your own self. They disbanded the former cops and replaced them with tested veterans of the revolutionary struggle. They put the worst torturers in prison and offered other jobs to the rest of them. The new police force was based on new class relations, where the government represents working people instead of attacking them. To be in the strongest position to organize, the working class needs to jealously defend the constitutional rights and protections that we've won over more than 250 years of class struggle. This includes freedom of speech, assembly, and worship, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, the right to trial by jury, and the right to confront your accuser, and much more. Any violation of these protections, no matter who's the target, will come back against the working class. Attacks on democratic and constitutional rights come from both the right and left in bourgeois politics. But today they're especially being driven by the left. I want to give a couple of examples. One is the trial of Derek Chauvin. We were among the hundreds of thousands who demanded that he be prosecuted for killing George Floyd. The ruling class very quickly, in face of those protests, decided to cut their losses and throw a few of their beat cops under the bus. Once they decided to do that, they used the same methods that they use when they want to go after one of us. They carried out a show trial atmosphere. They refused to move the venue of the trial. There were prejudicial statements up to Joe Biden saying, well, he should be convicted prior to the jury making its verdict, and much, much more. Then they carried out double jeopardy. He was tried a second time for the same thing under federal charges after being sentenced to 22 years in prison. All of this weakens the working class and fighters against police violence and abuse of our rights. Another example. Today there's a big effort by the Democrats to get Trump at all costs, which includes ramping up using the FBI and trying to refurbish its image, which is very tarnished among working people in general. But the FBI remains the political police of the ruling class. It has been and will be used principally against the working class and its vanguard, against the unions, against black rights organizations, against working class parties. Over the last couple of years, we've seen enough strikes and other struggles to confirm that the low point in working class and labor resistance is behind us. Members of the Socialist Workers' Party are part of fights against the bosses by the trade union struggles in the bakery workers union, the rail unions, and elsewhere. We work with fellow union members and others to strengthen the unions, to use union power. It's the only road to build a labor movement that fights in the interests of the whole working class. And I think a socialist revolution in the United States is inconceivable without organizing our class to fight to build unions and to use union power in the interests of working people around the world. The Socialist Workers' Party and our candidates explain the need to build a labor party based on the unions, to break with the Democrats, the Republicans, and all other class parties, capitalist parties like the Libertarians and Greens and so forth. In campaigning in working class neighborhoods, at factory gates, and elsewhere, we find a broad discussion taking place in the working class on the whole range of questions that we're facing today. The big debates and conflicts today are not between red states and blue states. They're at root class questions. I want to end by recommending two books in particular. One is The Turn to Industry, Forging a Proletarian Party by Jack Barnes, who's the National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party. It talks about what kind of a revolutionary working class party needs to be built, drawing on the experiences of the SWP over the last 4 decades. And the other is Malcolm X, Black Liberation and the Road to Workers' Power, also by Barnes. This talks about how in the last year of his life, Malcolm X increasingly became a revolutionary leader of the whole working class. How he explained there's a clash coming between the oppressed and those who do the oppressing, but it's not going to be based on the color of skin, as Elijah Muhammad has said, and as Malcolm X said at the time when he was in the Nation of Islam. In one of the last interviews he gave, Malcolm said he was trying to wake his people up. And the interview asks, kind of to their oppression. He says, no, people know they're oppressed. To wake people up to their self-worth, to their capacities, to their humanity. And that's what my party's trying to do as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi. CJ?
Okay. In this moment of emerging multipolarity, a period that promises, we shall see with what sincerity, not one hegemonic power on the world stage with its vassal, client, and puppet regimes, but multiple powers, without any one being dominant, we are beginning to see with some clarity the trajectory of political and economic development of the United States' foreign and domestic policy. This policy can be accounted for in 2 words, aggression and reaction. Aggression, in that U.S. imperialism, like the beast in a prolonged death spiral, is lashing out in all directions, attacking not only countries that dare to step outside of its so-called rules-based international order, Russia and China first and foremost, even little Haiti, but in due time, also its own domestic working class that will seek to free itself from increasingly repressive conditions and declining standards of living. Reaction, in that this lashing out is a product of the need to hold back the historical development. It is the insistence that the so-called end of history has not itself ended. Abroad, increasingly sovereign states will become subject once again to the pull of history towards socialism. At home, the working class are feeling the effects of living in an empire in decline. The time will soon come when they will look to the likes of us for ideological clarity to explain their declining state and the way out of it. The imperialist bourgeoisie and their state lackeys will, of course, seek to prevent this union of the working class and the politics that offer its salvation by rolling back workers' hard-won liberal rights, and to quote Georgy Dimitrov, by instituting an open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinist, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. Fascism, in a word. This is the context in which we must analyze all questions. The question today is about police, prisons, and the slogans demanding the abolition of both, particularly in the context of the 2020 protest movement, commonly known as the George Floyd or Black Lives Matter protests. I asked the listener, even before going into the classical Marxist theory of the state, if such slogans as abolish the police or abolish prisons fit into the plans of the bourgeoisie and the trajectory I've outlined, and I'm not alone in outlining. The answer clearly is a resounding no. We shall look first to Lenin, perhaps the foremost of Marxist theorist practitioners. This, by the way, is a good starting point for most inquiries. In The State and Revolution, Lenin begins his section titled The Special Bodies of Armed Men, Prisons, etc., with a quote from Engels describing the origins of the state as a necessary product of the division of human society into classes. This following quote summarizes the historical materialist understanding of the state and its repressive institutions. This special public power is necessary because a self-acting, armed organization of the population has become impossible since the cleavage into classes. This public power exists in every state. It consists not only of armed people, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and institutions of coercions of all kind, of which clan society knew nothing. What Engels is pointing out is that class society demands class rule, dictatorship of one class, the class of exploiters, over another, the class of exploited. And that as soon as this new form of politics and economy arose out of primitive society, there also arose institutions required to force the exploited class to submit to these antagonistic conditions. At the most general level, we and countless generations of our ancestors have lived under these conditions since the origins of class society. Lenin goes on to point us to another line of Engels. Public power, however, grows stronger in proportion as class antagonisms within the state grow more acute. To think these lines of Engels were written not in 2022, but in 1891, when the state was still quite primitive in relation to that which weighs on our shoulders today. As another example, we can look to the police states of the post-Soviet Eastern Europe that would put any exaggerated notions of the Stasi of the GDR to shame. Class struggle is presently awakening and will reach higher and higher levels. While it is possible that the ruling class will offer concessions, illusions, and magic tricks of all kinds, it is impossible that they will disarm themselves just before this upcoming period of class struggle and possibly class war. To the contrary, and to the great surprise of those advocating these slogans, yet is no surprise to materialists, imperialists will increase, not decrease, the levels of state repression. Lenin, by resurfacing these words of Engels, is pointing us to the fact that not only are these institutions of repression, police and prisons, central aspects of class rule, but that they are inseparable from class rule. That the only way that these can be abolished in substance and not just in name is the abolition of class society, their material foundation. Communism, the highest stage of socialism in a word. This is the only materialist form of abolitionism. Even when the proletariat has seized power, these repressive apparati, similar, though not identical, to police and prisons, will need to be created under the proletarian state in order to serve the interests of the proletariat, that class which was once exploited, over those of the bourgeoisie, that class which once exploited. In the practice of past and present socialist countries, such coercive institutions have been reformulated to serve the working class. Marx also pointed to the need of such despotic inroads on the rights of property. To argue for the abolition of these instruments of class rule is not only a pious wish that the bourgeoisie disarm themselves, but also the treasonous folly of advocating the proletariat yield to counter-revolution by doing the same. I will remind those advocating these slogans that the National Guard, a reserve force of the United States Army, was deployed during the BLM protests in Chicago. Even if the police is abolished, Chicago is essentially already occupied by the U.S. Army Reserve Forces, with somewhere between 6 to 8 armories scattered throughout the city and its suburbs. The path of escalation is police, then the National Guard, then the Army proper. We therefore should think in terms of Lenin's special bodies of armed men, a more inclusive category. As another aside, I have also been directed by a member of my organization to mention short-sighted and hypocritical tactics of portions of the left who cheerlead such institutions of the state, so long as they're repressing their supposed political enemies, think January 6th, but become abolitionists when they speak about their pet causes. Finally, slogans abolish the police and abolish prisons are in fact the opposite of materialist. They are idealist, not rooted in material conditions. They fail to account for the necessity of special bodies of armed men and the institutions of coercion in class society. Further, they do not account for the historical trajectory of U.S. imperial decline. In the final analysis, they confound and mislead more than they clarify and have no potential to be realized. I suggest those of us aspiring to be Marxists discard these slogans immediately and study the repressive institutions of the state through a dialectical materialist worldview, whence correct slogans can be derived. Thank you.
Thank you, CJ. All right. Now that we're done with responses, we can move on to responses between panelists. So if we could begin with Andy.
Who here in this audience favors, let me preface this. The United States spends as much on its military as the next 10 biggest powers. Who here in this audience supports defunding the military? Raise your hands, please. Most of you. What's the difference then in terms of demanding defunding the police? Especially in this city when, as they pointed out, you've got 40% of the operational budget. There was an article in the Tribune today about the billions that the city is spending on defending these crooked cops. I mean, I frankly get more than just a little bit upset when it's posed as a reformist demand that it would be replaced by rules of gangs and vigilantes. Who is Ronald Watts? Responsible for 250 wrongful convictions, people serving decades. Ronaldo Guevara serving 10, 20, 30, 35 years wrongful convictions. Now, I work as a law office. I'm not an attorney. I'm not representing them here. But I will tell you, I'm sick and fucking tired of writing these press releases about these overfunded cops getting off the hook over and over again, and nothing ever happens to them. And it's a systemic problem. It's not just an issue of a few bad apples. It starts right at the 5th floor of City Hall, and that is the core of our state here in this country. You look around the world, you listen to the politicians talking about we need to have, peaceful, relations here in the United States. Well, that's all built, so much of it, on exporting violence to Central America, the so-called third world, right now Ukraine, and any number of other areas of the world. So this state, at the core of it, is violence. And I totally agree with Timmy. Anything that we can do to lessen the power of the state, this side of overthrowing it, is important. When Lenin was writing State and Revolution, his main argument was with people in his own party who thought that we could coexist with the then provisional government, which was, so much better than the czarist dictatorship. But he made the point that revolutionary institutions could not coexist. In this case, the Workers' Councils, the Soviets, could not coexist with the capitalist government, that one or the other needed to win out at the end. And it was part of his argument for the overthrow of that provisional government by violent means, because that's the only way that the other side will give up its means of violence against us, its police, its prisons, and so forth. In terms of saying that the Black Lives Matter movement was primarily undercut by violence, I can only remember a phrase I heard on one of our demonstrations. And by our, I mean I was participating in demonstrations that were organized by others. And that's one guy who said, "Now your Michigan Avenue looks like ours," which I think really encapsulated the decades of violence that have committed. So we've already had gangs and vigilantes in this town, and I'm no fan of private gangs, but let's be clear about what the relations are, particularly in, say, K-Town on the west side, where the police are another gang. I really liked what Timmy said about the role of NGOs. I've seen over the decades, the NGOs are not only funded by the state in large part, they are an arm of the state. And I've seen them defang and lessen the impact of any number of social struggles. And frankly, for those of us who wish for a revolutionary transformation of United States society, they are going to be one of our biggest impediments. We think of previous mass movements in this country going back to, say, like the 1930s. They didn't have that dead weight of all these effing NGOs. You started to see them in the 60s and 70s. In fact, it was a very conscious policy of Richard Nixon and LBJ before him to fund these NGOs to basically try and control the process of reform that they saw as necessary. The last thing is this. I was a proud participant, as were some, no doubt many people in the room here who are old enough to remember, in the big 2003 demonstrations against the then impending Iraq War. And the New York Times had a phrase saying, well, this is now the new superpower, something worth that effect. I tried looking it up, I couldn't find it, but there was like, oh, this is the biggest mass demonstrations that the world has ever seen. And those of us who were part of that demonstration, we took over Lakeshore Drive and all that. But at the end of the day, the fuckers slaughtered, countless Iraqis and Afghans and others. We had a mass mobilization, but mass mobilizations, which are good for getting people involved in politics, are not. Mass sentiment alone is not enough to do the job. And we saw with the BLM movement, which was seen as the largest demonstrations to date in this country, mass sentiment, particularly amongst youth of all races. But again, it was not enough to overthrow the state. I think that we should look to defunding the military, defunding the police as goals that we are not going to be able to achieve this side of overthrow of the violent state, which will not allow itself to be peacefully voted away. But there are goals that we can achieve real gains. I mean, it's pretty funny. The best in terms of the mayoral candidates that you've got going right now in the current election is one candidate saying he's going to freeze the budget of the police. this budget that's already way up here. In the last mayoral election, all of the candidates, even the best of them, said they were going to increase the funding of the police. So small progress there, but I think we need to not lose track of who the biggest gang is in the city of Chicago. Thanks.
Right.
Thank you, Andy. Timmy?
Yeah. Wow. I was not expecting the range of our conversation today, but I love it. Building off of what was just shared, I do work in prisons and then I do anti-war work. And for me, one of our specific goals was has always been to make the domestic and international connections of abolition, right? It's not a coincidence that the police budget locally could be overlaid on the military budget nationally, right? It's not a coincidence that if you look at the prison system in Iraq after the war started,
right,
we exported it. You look at those, right?
Gave birth to
We're
ISIS.
literally exporting our the PIC abroad the world through empire, right? So abolition is a frame to make those connections, right? Not only is not something separate than abolition domestically or whatever. Tackling the police and prison here is a part of an anti-imperialist struggle more broadly, right? And to also, another note on the NGO thing, like, I've spent too much time reading military manuals. It's weird. But it's not new. These are tactics of you go into communities of colonized and warring populations. It's like it's one of the first tactics of like, we'll meet your needs and co-opt your, to maintain control. But as long as we're the ones controlling the type of resources that you're getting and limited infrastructure in a war-torn situation, right? And it's their new counterinsurgency tactics that are just like continually being deployed domestically as well as internationally. The last thing I'll say is, I work in Stateville, right? This is in Joliet, Illinois. This is a predominantly like white working class in certain pockets. But, most of the jobs of this city are workers at the prison, right? And if you go into the prison, I always try to point this out to people. There's a mural. The first thing you walk in is a worker, a prison guard in half orange crush, which is like the guard when there's a riot inside the prison. and the other half the person's wearing a military outfit, right? And so these, not only are these like theoretically, materially connect empire, certain parts of the same empire, these people understand themselves, people, agents of the state in prisons and policing understand themselves and are, many of them former, like Sheriff Tom Dart in the Cook County just said he's going down south to recruit veterans because recruitment is, he can't find workers in the Cook County jail, right? So there's lots of overlap there. And then a few pieces, abolition is a generative politics. It is not just a destructive one, which I hate having to go on the defensive to say that because there's much for us to destroy. But abolition is about building the world that makes prisons and policing obsolete, right? A part of that is communities have everything they need to thrive, and where a culture and systems of containment, disposability, and domination become obsolete. We don't need them because communism, because everybody's needs are met, right? Food, housing, healthcare, right? So that is all a part of, at least my understanding of what it means to be an abolitionist and work toward an abolitionist horizon. And then also, when we want to strongly caution us talking about, focusing on, the reasons for the George Floyd uprisings failing and focusing on the looting and the role of anarchists in those uprisings as a downfall, when we should not, whether or not you believe or disagree with that stance, to be talking about that in the context of the mass looting of corporations, of communities, of particularly poor black and brown communities, in that moment is unprincipled and is not the primary contradiction, right, that we should be focusing on, and if anything is the same language and frameworks that the state are using to target to then justify more policing. And I'm saying this as somebody who, as an anarchist who was targeted by the state for taking militant direct action against corporations, that then that same talking point was then used by the state to criminalize me and a bunch of other of my comrades and political collaborators, right? So if we are on the same page that we need some level of a united front across, tendencies and tradition and across the working class and different classes, then I think we got to really, stay clear on who the main enemies are and not throw each other under the bus, especially when that's going to end up risking further criminalization and expanding the state as well. I also think we gotta dump the vanguard talk about, there's people going to be looking to us. I think as organizers and people seeking revolutionary, horizons, we need to be approaching how are we in collaboration and learning from one another, from different communities, right, and seeing the needs of communities and sensibilities that are already being demonstrated within the uprisings, right, and reflecting those back and deepening them, and facilitating deeper collective understanding of what needs to happen. It's not so much this kind of we're going to save people. It's not going to work. It's just not, and it ends up, especially depending on the racial makeup of who the vanguard is, just going to end up replicating the same racist, hierarchies and disparities of power, whatever you want to do post-revolution. And then lastly, I encourage folks to look up, do some reading around racial capitalism as understanding that race is always a modality in which capital is lived, right? And that, we can't talk about making it about race when it's about class. There's been theorists that have kind of pushed us past that and understand that it's always both. And yeah.
Thank you, Timmy. Naomi?
Yeah. Well, the armed bodies of men of the state, or the military and the armed bodies they use domestically, or an extent, there's a connection. The question is, what do you replace them with? How do you get rid of them? I mean, we're we say not one penny, not one person for the imperialist war machine. At the same time, we know that any call for simply disarmament, as I think in the founding program of our party in 1938, says disarmament, but who's going to disarm whom? The ruling class is not going to give up their arms. They need to be disarmed, but to do that, there's no general thing. There's no abstract slogan of disarmament. What's needed is to replace the class dictatorship of the capitalists with the working class in power, with the workers and farmers government led by the working class that can actually replace those armed bodies of men with a state that, as Lynn says, it's a state that's starting to no longer be is already in the process of being something different, because it actually is the majority in power. I think the example of the Cuban Revolution is really valuable. In the rebel army, as they fought to overthrow the Batista dictatorship, they forged a cadre of workers and peasants who, among other things, the discipline that they had within there. I mentioned they said, we're not going to have vengeance. I mean, the discipline in the rebel army is they did not allow any abuse of the peasants. They didn't allow abuse of captured soldiers of the dictatorship, who were and those attitudes extended to after taking power, when they disbanded the police and the military and all the repressive forces of the old regime, and created new institutions of class rule, of the rule of the majority. They were based on the cadres that had gone through that. It has to be replaced. If you simply, sometimes when there's big protests around police brutality, the cops in various cities, and we've seen this here, we've seen it in New York, in Minneapolis, and other places, the cops will pull back from policing the working class neighborhoods. They'll say, well, let them kill each other, and we'll show them that they're needed. And you see a spike in all kinds of antisocial things that have a devastating effect on individuals and communities. I'm not arguing for having more policing of communities, but I'm talking about the reality that exists within capitalist society, and the fact that part of what capitalism does, the dog-eat-dog values that come from the very top, that come from the whole thing, that everything's built around what makes a profit, they affect human. There's workers and others who become declassed, who become lumpenized, who carry this out. That's a lot of what the gangs do. The violence of the gangs is an extension of the violence that the ruling class, like I work on the railroad, they're slashing jobs. They don't give, and making conditions much, much more dangerous, both for the workers and for anybody that lives near railroad tracks. They will do actuary of, what it will cost them in settlement payouts to cut corners on safety. All of these big companies do this, the mine bosses, everybody. It's an extension of that, but we start changing our nature as human beings as we start organizing together. I think when you see big social movements, that's when you see decline in like street violence and stuff like that. At the height of the civil rights movement, at the height of the big union battles in the 1930s, you had a real decline in that kind of thing. But that's where it comes from. Anyway, that's what I'm getting at on the question. It's not to say, yes, the cops act as a gang. You give, in addition to the examples you gave, John Burge and so forth, it's absolutely no defense of them, but it's explaining that if you simply, and why so many workers, when they hear defund the police, they're like, no. And it's for good reasons out of their thing. And it's got to be a question of what kind of movement do we build and what builds the confidence. If I can take one more moment. On the question of the looting and stuff, I went up to Kenosha a couple days after the cops shot Jacob Blake there. And what you'd seen a massive immediate response in the community against this outrage of shooting this unarmed black man yet again. But then you also saw the reaction, a lot of the shops and stuff were still smoldering. This was on the third day. This is actually right before, I was there the afternoon before the events where Kyle Rittenhouse shot the 3 people there. And, talking to people like in the park and in the neighborhoods and stuff, a lot of workers who wanted to go out and protest the police brutality were dissuaded from joining a fight and a lot of people who were very sympathetic to protesting against what the police had done, you start burning down the stores and the gas stations and so forth, and it does undercut the throat. It's not an effective form of fight, and it is important for us to discuss this. And it's not throwing each other under the bus to discuss these things.
Thank you, Naomi. CJ?
To build off that, look at what kind of class alliance does the United States need? She said earlier, workers, farmers, but perhaps there's a role for the petty bourgeoisie, and I don't think that's how you make friends with the petty bourgeoisie. Looting, burning. Anyway, not to magnify that too much. Now, looking at these mass movements, what would traditionally be called spontaneous movements, it's always a problem of leadership. So, to a great extent, what we find is the left today tails. It follows it, but it doesn't develop the consciousness, doesn't expand the demands of whatever mass movement arises. And so that's why we kind of keep going in these, that's partially why at least, in these kind of spirals without getting anywhere. Someone else mentioned Iraq, anti-Iraq demonstrations, 2003. So to me, it's a question of leadership. Now, I made a point of saying that we're 15 people in my organization, so we're not anywhere near that by any means. But the leadership needs to have this revolutionary theory. There cannot be no revolutionary movement without revolutionary theory, Lenin tells us, right? And the workers on their own can only develop a relatively low level of consciousness, just by themselves. In dialogue with the advanced section, the vanguard, we can develop and elevate workers' consciousness. We're not, we take workers where they are, but then we want to develop them to be more conscious, and I don't know. And the most advanced to have a greater theoretical understanding, the way the world works, right? So, yeah, but I can't really stress that enough. It's a question of leadership. The working class will revolt, but will it do anything is the question. And I think to a large extent that's a question of leadership. So, to me, the first thing to do is develop theoretical understanding within a group of people so that they can become leaders, right? So the goal is to create a party. Now, finally, just to end, the way one of our friends, or co-panelists, puts abolitionism, kind of wonder, why do we need a new term? If essentially it's communism, according to our co-panelist, why not just say communism? Why say abolitionism? Are we just afraid of the C word? Are we, or is abolitionism something different? Okay.
Thank you, CJ. And thank you to all the panelists for your opening remarks and responses to each other. So now I'd like to open the discussion up to audience questions. Just feel free to raise your hands and I'll try to get to you all in order.
I had some quick responses if we're waiting for some questions. The piece about the looting, the claim that it wasn't effective, or that it wasn't effective, whether or not you agree with it morally, or that it was a representation of a moral, the just moral position. I would, if at least from my understanding of effective, is that we were winning. The ruling class was scared and ready to concede power, some elements of reformist policy, blah 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 blah. Right? If that was my metric, and by those standards, it was probably the most effective moment of expression of political power against the ruling elite I've experienced in my entire life. Right? You had entire city councils ready to disband their police forces and refund, fund other social services, blah 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 blah. Like that was probably one of the main reasons I stayed community organizing was because of the experience of the uprisings and what the potential of what that could mean if we were able to learn and sustain and build deeper networks and practice better movement rhythms of like sustainability and resourcing, local communities and all that. Like if we were able to sustain militant confrontations with the state and capital in the ways that were demonstrated and exemplified throughout that summer of the uprisings, that's the goal. That's the goal to me, right? And then, that's just one thing to say about that, is that for me it was probably the most effective moment in terms of if we're understanding effectiveness as like actual wins against and chipping away of the status quo.
Ben?
I was wondering, interestingly enough, I think all four panelists are sort of grounding the question of policing, where policing originates, what policing functions for, in the state and capitalism more generally. One sort of discourse that generated, certainly before BLM, but especially through BLM, is sort of the particularity of policing with regard to race, that it serves to oppress black people, or at least distinctively from sort of the rest of the population. I guess I sort of have two questions, which is one, what are the panelists, any panelists who are willing to sort of comment, conceptions of policing with regard to race, how it's distinctive or not distinctive, and what that would mean for the left in terms of our conception of how to grapple with policing in some kind of emancipatory movement.
Well, I think briefly, it comes back to my point about racial capitalism as a lens to understanding the state and capital, right? And it's not capitalism as some separate than as racism, that these are systems that are working together. And I mean, for me, understanding that specifically in the U.S. context, the U.S. state apparatus was founded and produced in the context of slavery, transatlantic slavery and indigenous genocide, right? That's not and those, the understanding of who is human and who isn't is actually a material reality, right? And that informs, all of the systems that are produced from that, that ideological understanding. And so for me, you can't talk about capitalism without talking about anti-black racism in the context of the United States, right? I mean, the statistics, these are specifically used to police and dispose of communities that have been deemed disposable, right? And then it just continues to go that way, right? And so I think we have to be clear about that and what that means for, especially as we're talking about questions of leadership and the communities we're trying to build with and support and resources and deepen ties with, right? That that we're living in an anti-black context of social relations, that dominate and color everything, all of the kind of economic, social, political systems of our country, right? And you can't escape that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, go.
May I respond to that too? So, I see the particular oppression of black people under capitalism to be a divide and rule strategy, more than, say, something that, like, it's not separate from capitalism. It's not something that runs parallel to it. It is capitalism, and it's a strategy employed by the ruling class. So going to another aspect of the comment, looking at like indigenous genocide, these kinds of things, it's not a question about who's human and who's not human. Humanity, speaking in those terms, it's very liberal, first of all, but also vague. It doesn't really matter who's human and who isn't. We're all human, and I think everyone recognizes that. But it's a matter of class interests, and so you're not in the class, is the question. And so, speaking of indigenous genocide, that's an American form, a very American form of primitive accumulation. So you can see that in class terms, rather than, say, not liking indigenous people or thinking that, I don't know, if we measure their head this way, their cranium is somehow smaller or something like this. It's not racism at the root of it. It's primitive accumulation. It's class interests.
Well, you know, U.S. Capitalism was built not just on slavery. The U.S. history is kind of unique compared to, like, you know, Europe, in that it never went through a period of feudalism. It was capitalist from the beginning, including the form that chattel slavery took, you know, in the United States, and the racist ideology that was promoted and created in order to justify chattel slavery. But it was based on exploited labor, North and South, in a black skin and in a white skin. And the origins of policing in the United States come both from, in the North, it came out of the night watchmen for the factories. It all came out of guarding capitalist property. In the South, it came out of the slave patrols. And it's been an anti-working class institution of class rule from the beginning, as are the rest of institutions of class society. Yes, there is no way you can make a revolutionary change in the United States without it involving the fight against racist discrimination, and you know, the legacies that come from that, and you know, and what remains today. You know, but it's also not accurate to say that American capitalism is based on races. You know, that racism is the dominant thing. It's class rule, and racism is one of the parts of it. They are completely intertwined, and the fight to get rid of them is completely intertwined. The working class taking power is what will open the door to actually finally being able to get rid of racism and the other forms of oppression, the oppression of women, which actually dates back much further to the beginnings of class society, and so forth. That doesn't mean, obviously, you don't fight for, you know, against every manifestation of these things as they are today, and that's part of mobilizing the forces that can lead to the working class taking power and overthrowing the dictatorship of capital. But you know, just if you look at all the statistics on police people killed by the police, the majority are Caucasian. But they're disproportionately black and of other oppressed nationalities. Both things are true. This is the violence of the cops is an anti-working class violence, but as in every other aspect of society, things come down especially hard. You know, whether it's unemployment, housing conditions, etc., it comes down disproportionately on those who are the most oppressed and exploited, which in the U.S. is, you know, are those who are black and, you know, at various times other oppressed nationalities and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that I understand what your question is, but let me take a stab at it anyway. was at a meeting last night where at one point we briefly recounted the many broken promises of our current mayor. It was quite a list, but one of the big ones that she actually has made some moves to do something about was in terms of beginning to do some modicum of funding in the south and west sides, the so-called Invest Southwest. Now, with all the other broken promises, everything from reopening mental health clinics to elected school board, et cetera, this is the one she's actually done a tiny little bit about. And I think you could put that directly at the fact that the violence, which has been endemic for decades, the deprivation that has been endemic for decades, finally hit Streeterville at all. It's finally hit the Magnificent Mile. That's why Invest Southwest is going on right now. And just another thing, this whole idea that, if you get rid of the police, if there's a mass movement that gets rid of the police, let's look at what actually happens during the context of mass movements, not just in this country, but over and over again around the world. When there is a general strike, the first thing that happens is that people begin to say, well, the state is temporarily not working in our town of, say, Minneapolis, St. Paul, circa 1934. We're going to have to start organizing medical care, food distribution, and yes, we'll have to organize groups of trusted people to make sure that that there isn't violence and try and keep a lid on that sort of thing. You see that over and over again in mass uprisings. So it's not like if you just get rid of the police, nothing happens. And you saw this in limited areas in terms of the BLM movement on sections of the south and west sides where mutual aid was inaugurated, often by people with few resources. You saw that with the Black Panther survival programs. This isn't the idea that, this is going to be the be-all and end-all, but it was a step in terms of beginning to form that dual power that we saw in full flower in the period between the February Revolution in Russia, 1917, and the October Revolution. It was an inherently unstable situation, but that's how people have over and over again. In Iran, it was the Shoras. In Chile, they had their councils, and over again, you have these different forms of self-organization that are not imposed from on high by me because I've studied revolutionary movements around the world telling people. The main thing in terms of revolutionary leadership, it's not proclaimed, it's earned. It's earned by being part of the struggle and learning from that struggle, learning more from the struggle itself than any teaching that someone with gray hairs like me might do.
Two quick things. My name is David. I moved here to Chicago recently from Minneapolis, and went through that whole experience. I mean, one thing that is striking is that yes, the majority of the city council in Minneapolis proclaimed that they were getting rid of the police, but any serious person never believed that was going to happen, because the ruling class will have their police. And so it's a real question. I would say I had the experience of in the initial days of the upsurge after George Floyd's killing of the majority. I mean, my coworkers, I was working at a Walmart at that time, were participating in the actions that were going on. Were very much part of that. The thing that really, I mean, I have to agree with Naomi, that undercut that participation was the violence that was taking place. By those that were burning down property and carrying out other kinds of provocative things. It became very difficult to get more and more broad participation in these kinds of things. And that was my experience. I'm really happy that a number of the speakers on the panel pointed to State and Revolution by Lenin. It's definitely worth studying. One of the things that Lenin points to in drawing on the experience of Marx and Engels is that Marxists do share something with anarchists. They are ultimately for the abolition of the state, but they have a very sharp difference, over how we get to that. Can it simply be abolished, or does the working class have to organize itself to constitute itself as a state in order to consolidate the power of workers and peasants to defeat and when you come to power, the bourgeoisie doesn't go away. The capitalists don't go away, and so it was a very sharp difference. But going back to Marx, these were very sharply debated questions and important questions to debate. And I think that the panel here today is one of the things I really like about it is that there are sharp differences, but there is civil conversation and civil discussion about these things, and we do have to face up to them. One thing I would just say in closing, Naomi pointed to the Cuban Revolution, but if you look at the Russian Revolution, which Andy's talked about, the fight that Lenin led, including inside the Bolshevik Party, of fighting for all power to the Soviets. Well, what were the Soviets? The Soviets were a government, a state of workers and peasants that had come into being through the course of struggle. It was the replacement for the rule of the capitalists. It wasn't spontaneous either, although it had plenty of spontaneous elements to it, but it was led. Just as the 1934 strikes in Minneapolis, these were not spontaneous things to happen. These were led by very conscious class struggle fighters who led and organized on all of these questions. And so that's the question is, how do we build the kind of movement that's able to actually challenge the capitalists for power and to replace their power through, we have to make a revolution, but then it's not a question of abolition, it's a question of us organizing ourselves to take hold of the state.
One quick thought is to this piece around, organizing to take over the state. I think, I'm not necessarily, well, no, I am. I think we just need to be really specific and clear about what the conditions, material conditions, will look like in the United States. We are a massive country, and struggling in locally in different regions and contexts and states is going to look very different from state by state, right? And it's not going to be there's not going to be a simple blueprint of, this is the moment, the workers are organized, now's our chance. It's going to look very messy, chaotic, because the culture, the culture in the U.S. is so uniquely hyper-capitalist, white supremacist, and all these things. Like, we're dealing with a lot, and we're also in such a vast, in terms of the land, resources, and political makeup of infrastructure, that I think folks really need to start mapping out what, as conditions sharpen in different regions, is going to look different in the city of Chicago versus downstate, versus in the South, versus on the West Coast, as resources and climate change start to get worse. And for me, I have read State and Revolution. I read a lot of Marxist theorists, and I also read a lot of anarchist theory and text. And something I encourage other folks to also read is anarchist theory and planning around direct action and structure and organization, particularly around how decentralized networks of resource distribution and organizing ourselves in the context of crises situations and places where the state where there are no resources and the state there are vacuums of power, that folks really need to get as much tools and resources as possible to know how to move ourselves and organize as these conditions sharpen and get worse, because it's going to look different in different contexts. So that's just a genuine, coming from a genuine place of there's a lot out there, and we need to be engaging and strategizing around all of it.
Yeah, hi, my name is Roger, and I live in the suburbs, and this sounds like a post-mortem of the whole movement to abolish policing, rather than. And do you see it this way? Do you folks see this as a movement that's played itself out, that's exhausted itself, or do you see this as like the first act, and that and if you do, then how do you build? How do you build? Where do you go? Where do we go then from here? Because you know the spontaneity of those demonstrations was remarkable. I mean, it just came. No one predicted this. No one saw this coming. But the response throughout the country, or let me put it this way, you know, even while these demonstrations were occurring, the murders throughout the country continued. They continued all over the country. The difference, of course, was they were publicized. They were on the nightly news, which is a feature that hadn't really occurred, at least in my lifetime. I remember the Rodney. What was his name?
Rodney King beating.
Yeah, that 1992 and the eruption there. But well, I'll just stop and let you respond. Has this particular movement played itself out, or are there gains that or is this, I say, the first act? Do you see we can build for something here, or not? Is this really the postmortem?
Capitalist society is going to generate all kinds of protests and actions in response to things. Look at what's going on in Iran today. You had a couple months ago, the so-called morality police murdered this young woman for supposedly not wearing her headscarf right. And it sparked really a resurgence of protests that have been happening for the last several years that intertwine a number of different questions. I mean, the questions of women's rights, the questions of the oppressed nations within Iran, especially opposition to the military adventures of the regime in Iran. And they, in the protests at this point, despite the government repression, don't show any sign of ending at this point. At the same time, they're not going to be able, until there's the kind of leadership built, which will I think partly be built in the course of the struggle, that can actually replace the regime in Iran with workers' power, which you have a rich experience in Iran. If somebody mentioned the Shoras, the workers' councils that developed during the 1979 revolution. There's a whole rich history in Iran. Until that happens, there will be ups and downs, and there's not just you don't have just continued protests, and then all of a sudden you're going to have the working class in power without developing some kind of leadership, and it'll take different. So there's been there will be more protests in the U.S. in response to police abuses and other things. There'll be, big labor battles that'll unfold because of what the bosses are pushing. And the biggest thing that you gain in any of them is broadening out solidarity, interconnections between workers in struggle, learning from the different experiences. I think debating these questions out is extremely important. We will see more things like that. I mean, anyway, it was striking to me, just in terms of the scope of the United States. That's one of the things that was so striking in those protests was how many tiny towns all over in rural areas and so forth, there were protests. It's a sign of something of people looking. And I think it was a response that had to do with not simply, the outrage that people felt when they saw that video of Chauvin on top of George Floyd, but the whole range of what's been happening in experiences with the cops, but also more broadly with the bosses, with the other things that working people are facing. We'll see more things like that.
Whenever I want to really depress myself, I start thinking about the immense power of the state. I mean, just it's mind-boggling. I mean, just the nuclear modernization program of President Obama's up to $2 or $3 trillion right now, and you just think of all. I mean, not just the prisons
Right.
that were mentioned here, but just the vast array of numerous policing, the NSA, and things talked about by Edward Snowden and others in terms of the immense resources that are poured into ensuring the savage inequalities in this country. And then you think of just how incredibly atomized this society is, more so out in places like the burbs. But you just think of, probably the only other societies that approach the atomization of Americans from each other might be in China or Russia also, not coincidentally probably, being major powers themselves. And on the other hand, you think of, it wasn't just George Floyd, it was Tamir Rice in 2014. And I saw a number of the organizers because I knew that they were talking to families of the deceased and so forth. You could see the PTSD in their eyes. And so it's very, very difficult in those circumstances of immense violence and oppression to continue on. But I'm very convinced that many of those people will be back when there is another another upsurge. I mean, one of the values of political organization is it sustains people like us during the lower times. We read, we study, so we understand that we're part of not just one movement, but a grand sweep of history and how people in far more difficult circumstances have managed to not only persist but achieve gains. You think of what was done in the Great Depression in this country in circumstances that we can only begin to imagine, the deprivation, the lack of social programs, and yet people who are literally starving created the mass union movement in this country. And we're beginning to see right now, I remember during the height of the pandemic, just thinking about, they keep on patting all these healthcare workers and all of the so-called essential workers. They keep on patting people like us on the back. People are going to come back and say, okay, now it's our fucking turn. And we've already begun to see that in places that none of us predicted, Starbucks, Amazon, etc. And it's got a long ways to go given the utter devastation of the union movement in this country. But that's the beginnings of the sort of solidarity that we saw at the heart of the BLM movement, where activists were helping each other out. And there was, of course, all sorts of divisions and infighting in that movement, as there are in every social movement. Any reading of the civil rights movement of the early 1960s, no, it wasn't just all hunky-dory, everyone skipping off to the promised land. There were bitter fights and all sorts of sectarianism and nastiness, but there's also lots of human kindness to each other and just selfless solidarity. That we saw in places like Iran in 1979 with the oil workers going on strike and the massive women's movement of that era. We see it over and over again. So people will be back. The principled folks, those who went on to develop careers, good riddance to them. But the vast majority of people in this country continue to be screwed, and especially black and other oppressed people. And this system can't help but create its own gravediggers.
Yep.
So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think I would respond to the question is it a dead movement or is it the first stage? I would just say, well, we got to decide. That's a question for us, and I think what I'm saying by that is the ideas of abolition, the political values, the strategies of abolition, those were all intentionally like co-developed with organizers, theorists, and you know, you can trace the lineage of specifically abolition, prison abolitionism, as a set of ideas developed over time through, on the West Coast, through thinkers like Ruthie Gilmore, Dylan Rodriguez, and like critical resistance as a formation on the West Coast, right? And you know, and being popularized. I think if anything, it's symptomatic of how far we can popularize radical demands and ideas, and how they can spark when it resonates with a mass sensibility or mass tendency or mass experience, and what can happen when those things align just right. So for me, because when these ruptures happen, that's when the status quo in terms of ideology and culture, it gets mushy. And that's our opportunity to popularize and deepen and raise raise the elements of our understandings collectively. So for me, it's like, all right, we gotta deepen it further as these conditions work and more conflict arises, and I think part of that too for me is also understanding police violence and the war against literal war as actually as militarism, as domestic iterations of militarism and low intensity warfare, in many instances not low intensity warfare, and understanding that we're up against massive propaganda machines in the same way we talk about the U.S. military industrial complex and the psychological operations divisions totally dedicated to propaganda and stuff. That same stuff is happening to the police. Like, why does there so many freaking local newspapers and publications that are like popular? The only thing they cover is crime, right? And it's because they have entire agencies and departments and businesses, corporate businesses, that are popularizing these narratives of crime and punishment and disposability, right? But yeah. So we gotta, and that we have to have forces and communications operations and propaganda work to combat that and counter that at the same time, and that's prepared for the moments when those sensibilities rupture and are open to resonate with one another and deepen and take action, collective action. So yeah.
So first of all, thanks to all the speakers for what's been a lively discussion and talk so far. My apologies, I was not here for Comrade Andy and Timmy's initial presentation, so my questions are for the discussion that follows afterwards. So it seems to me that a lot of the sort of tensions that have come up in the conversation are playing themselves out maybe more similarly in sort of the world right now, because we're talking about the issue of abolition, right? First, like on the context of, like, say, the left, of which we are part of, right? On the one hand, right, you want to abolish, be it the police or the carceral state, because from a Marxist perspective, you have the state, you have the special bodies of armed men, right, or constitutive of the capitalist state. I think Lenin's State and Revolution was brought up, and they are not neutral. They're in the service of the bourgeoisie, capital, etc. There's that, and another more contemporary leftist argument is that, oh, well, there's something known as carceral capitalism, and you have, like, for instance, the war on drugs, the sort of the Reagan liberal era coming to its own, leading to sort of the sort of disproportionate incarceration of black people, particularly young black men or whatever, and sort of that's something that needs to be fought against, this sort of incarceration, sort of abolition on a sort of leftist basis over the last few decades, right? So those are the two contexts for that argument being made. But then I think Comrade CJ and also Naomi raised the sort of good point that, you're talking to abolish this, but one has to take into consideration the regular working class today, right? They may be disproportionate victims of, for instance, incarceration, as Naomi put it, but it was also helpfully pointed out that they're also, because it disproportionately targets their community, crime, they're the most ardent ardent defenders of law and order, and for instance, the law, right? And sort of if one were trying to reconstitute a mass leftist politics nowadays, one would like alienate them, right? In trying to convince them to join the movement or whatever by saying, oh, abolish the police, I think, as the comrades helpfully pointed out. And sort of this conflict within, like, I think, within leftists and activists, the movement, whatever you want to call it, is refracted maybe at large within more mainstream, broader politics nowadays, and maybe the issue of electoral constituencies within the Democratic Party, right? Like, oh, like there's a lot of anxiety over, like, oh, where are people of color going to vote? Where are community constituencies going to vote in upcoming elections, right? And on the other hand, oh, what about the working class, right? Can the Democratic Party, like, you know, still, like, you know, have the working class vote for them, or is it going to be increasingly Republican? So there's a very interesting parallel between, I think, the sort of issues that are raised here versus the issues that are going on in maybe broader society that move out of the realm of, say, maybe more leftist discussions. And sort of the question I want to ask, I first want to clarify what the question is not. The question is not like, how do you distinguish yourself from a Democrat? Because that's not usually productive. People just say, like, I'm not a Democrat, right, for XYZ reasons, or they say, I'm a Democrat and yes, I killed Rosa Luxemburg or something. Like, that's not very, like, it's funny, but it's not particularly productive. So the more productive question is this issue of consonance, of disagreements within the left, to more broader ones of disagreements within, like, the Democratic Party at large. How do you, is this merely a coincidence that it's going on right now, or if it's not, how deeper into the 20th century and maybe beforehand does this consonance go? Certain conflicts within, like, sort of the organized left playing itself out on a broader scale within more mainstream capitalist politics. Sorry, that was a mouthful. And I would like to hear maybe from maybe Timmy and CJ first, and then get maybe the older people to Naomi and Andy. I know, Andy, I joked with you last time about, like, you not being old, but sort of just because of that more experience, it might be helpful to hear in this particular order this question.
I might need a
You're an old person.
I might need a follow-up on just, like, clarification on the. So what is our thoughts on, like, the seemingly, like, similar theme of
similar disagreements within, like, the left right now on abolition, but also extending all the way back maybe into the 70s and 80s, right, in the Reagan era, when abolitionism as an activist issue came into its own, right, the seeming parallels and the tensions within the organized left on these issues, also seemingly having a parallel within the issue of sort of maybe electoral constituencies within the Democratic Party.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
I don't know what I can say about electoral constituencies within the Democratic Party, but I mean, to me it seems like kind of a question about, let's see, formulate the thoughts. It's the old question of reform, revolution. It's the old question of materialism and idealism, and these things go back, well, as far back as our tradition, right? I have no other way to explain it than that.
Well, I would say, yeah, I think you can look at that, like, why is it that, you know, impacted community, the most disproportionately impacted communities, why are so many communities that are being harmed by these systems and structures still at the end of the day, you know, supportive of some of these structures, right? You can look at that from a perspective of, like, oh, what's wrong with the working class, or what's wrong with that, or you can look at it as, like, how messed up, you know, how deeply, like Andy has mentioned, how deeply entrenched these, you know, the divestment of communities, right, and how there are so little options, right? The left is not, we are not a left of, like, the left of Brazil, right? We do not have the social structures and infrastructures that to support communities where they actually can survive better than if they're than surviving with what they can get from this mediocre and even abusive U.S. state, right? So I think it's an indictment of the left more broadly of like our capacity to support and meet the needs of our communities, and not so much like an indictment of right. And I think additionally, I think that like that's the main thing. Is like in terms of I will say that like we cannot. I work directly with a lot of incarcerated people, right? A lot of people impacted by police violence, and there's not we can't we should not speak in generalizations about different communities. Like that is just what does I say, unscientific, right? And because I know lots of people that are are super against the police, right? Super against the police. There's you can try to assess that through lens of generational lenses, right? You can assess that through like like cultural like what how that's being shaped by culture and I think the point there is that like that needs to be contested, that reality, that people do not feel that people are forced in an abusive position to rely on the state, right? That it is our job as our communities to try to meet those needs ourselves, such that questions of security and stability that people are not forced to rely on a violent apparatus and system, right? And that's why abolition is so important, specifically because of all the other like tendencies and frameworks that came out in addition to it, right? Because if we're trying to make the prisons obsolete, we also have to come up with frameworks, interpersonal, relational, social frameworks on how to address harm in our communities, accountability. I've been a part of several community accountability processes where we're trying to have to navigate how do we keep each other safe. How do we make amends and repair relations when harm happens that doesn't rely on the same, cultures of disposability and violence of the state itself, right? And that's a hard. We have to be able to do that work at the same time. Otherwise, it's an uphill battle.
Make a comment about the Democratic Party, which, it's, as I mentioned, I think it's the largest part of U.S. imperialism today. It's in crisis, as is the Republican Party, because none of them have any answers to the problems it faces. But, they none of them can solve the basic underlying problems of the capitalist system. One of the things you see in the Democratic Party today is a good chunk of the left is in the Democratic Party. And the left wing of the Democratic Party is pushing especially identity politics, that everything goes around identity constituencies, which is one of the things I think tearing up the Democrats. And it's a poison within the working class movement to be defining everybody by your identity, as opposed to, talking about classes and acting, and building class solidarity and so forth. One of the other things that especially the left wing of the Democratic Party promotes today is basically various things that point to dependency on the capitalist state. Forms of welfare, forms of looking. I'll give you a concrete example. Here in Illinois, one of the points that's going to be on the ballot is this Amendment 1, which is put forward as a workers' rights amendment. It does. We're taking a position of not voting for or against it because it actually does absolutely nothing. The rights aren't given to us by the state. We fight for and win them. And this is, it reinforces a looking to the state and the Democratic Party to protect our rights as opposed to us fighting and organizing. What we need as opposed to dependency and welfare is, a fight, especially led by the labor movement, for jobs. For instance, the fight to shorten, right now there's lots of people out of work. They'd say very low unemployment numbers, but the reality is there's a smaller percentage of, people working than in a long time. It has not gone up substantially. the fight for, and then the jobs that do exist, a lot of them, they want you to work, crazy overtime or schedules that make it impossible to, to spend time with your family. That's what a lot of the labor battles have been over. That's what the issues in the rail contract negotiations, that's at the heart of it. So a fight for jobs, for shortening the work week with no cut in pay to spread work around and take it out of the boss's profits, the fight for cost of living raises, and so forth. All of those things, things that help to strengthen, and things that we fight for, not that the state's going to give to us. I think looking at those questions is an important piece of this. So I don't know if that quite gets at your question, but it is, we're taking a look at what's happening in the main capitalist parties today and how they're being also shaken up.
We ready for Gramps now? This disagreements on the left regarding abolition. I mean, first you have to say, who is the left? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we're talking about organized left party formations of one sort or another, unfortunately, we're pretty irrelevant at this point in terms of this country of 300 plus million people. I mean, I wish it was different, but that's the sad truth. The issue of how people feel about police, how working class people feel about policing is not just racial, it's not just class, it's also generational. Because a very common experience in the city of Chicago, and I see this from all these wrongful conviction cases, you'll have cops who will pick up a young person in one neighborhood and they don't get what they want in terms of some information, whatever, they drop them off into another gang territory. They let the gang wars do their fight for them. They basically are subcontracting the violence in that respect. They get people from rival gangs to testify against each other about stuff so they can, quote unquote, solve the murders. This is so common in the Ronaldo Guevara cases over and over again. Hero cop solves all these dozens of murders, and now we're finding out, of course, after decades of wrongful conviction, that they never got anyone who did the murders. If that would even be a solution. In terms of the Democrats, one of the things that I watched a very good PBS documentary over and over again about the fall of Reconstruction. People know the history probably in broad outlines about how the Republicans were the party against slavery and a modicum of support for black people. The moment the Panic of 1873 hit, the Republicans, who had been in power for decades as the party against at least racist oppression, they cut loose black Americans and basically fed them to the wolves, and the ensuing decades were probably the worst history of racist violence that went on through the 1920s, from the 1870s to the 1920s, even worse than it happened in the period following the Civil War. And I think the Democrats, who have proclaimed over and over again being for working class people and riding on their coattails on that for decades, are getting their comeuppance right now with the Republican Party, falsely claiming, we're the party for the common people, and so on and so forth. And the moment that the economy hits the skids, then you have this eruption of racist violence. You see the growth of Proud Boy type groups and so on and so forth. And so whoever wins on November 8th and going forward, I think we're going to have a very, very ugly time right now, because both parties have shown themselves to be utterly bankrupt in terms of meeting the needs of working class people. And it's clearly been a ticket to power to play on racism, on nativism, and anti-LGBTQ bigotry. It's been their ticket to power. I mean, you're seeing the Republicans surging right now, and the Democrats have got no one to blame but themselves, because they have sold out working class people for so many decades. beginning with the neoliberalism of Jimmy Carter, and then of course Bill Clinton. So I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Does that answer your question, Kevin?
It doesn't, so I'm going to repeat maybe the ending part of the question. So is what we're seeing right now, like the discussion of abolition, where there are tensions, where it seems across, like, say, racial identity lines, it comes off as an antinomy, it's versus that amongst, like, class lines, right, working class lines. It's like you also see, like, an analog in the sort of discussions amongst electoral constituencies in the Democratic Party, right, and also the Republicans, but let's just emphasize the Democrats, right? Is it merely a coincidence at this moment in 2022 that the same tensions are playing out amongst the left and also amongst, like, the Democrats in their electoral constituency? And if it's not a coincidence, or even if it, like, is, right, how far back might this tendency where there's this sort of consonance in the sort of tensions in, like, within itself playing out, like, how far back does it go? I think CJ came the closest with addressing this when he pointed to Rosa Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution, but maybe there are different moments from the 20th century that might come to your guys' mind as, like, precedents for the moment of, like, consonance between tensions within the Democrats and those on the left.
So Kevin, by coincidence, you mean divisions over race versus class within the left and within the Democratic Party?
Yeah.
Well, class is the identity that never speaks its name. You know? But then, you know, you have leftists who dismiss the thoroughly race-driven narrative that so much of our country was built on in terms of the extirpation of Native Americans and slavery, which played a pivotal role in the development of American capitalism. I mean, every time I think that identity politics has run its course because you have a Clarence Thomas or whatever, then someone comes up and says that race is irrelevant to the development of American capitalism. Here we go again. You know, let's play part in the divide and conquer. I mean, capitalism, its main goal is to make money, to do it by any means necessary, and race has clearly been pivotal to dividing American workers, going back to the steel strikes in the early part of the last century forward. It's been the albatross on the working class in the south of this country, and to diminish race as a powerful force, racism is a powerful force buttressing American capitalism is just foolish. I mean, the early Socialist Party in the United States was a disaster area for that. Eugene V. Debs, for all his many merits, said that the Socialist Party has got nothing special to offer black people. I'm paraphrasing here. But it was only actually the intervention of the Third International and the early American Communist Party began to turn some of that around. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I don't think I have I'm not sure. The only thing I'll say is, because I'm not quite sure if it feels relevant to say, but I'll just say, like, if you don't understand reparations as a communist measure, then that's not, I'm not interested in that platform, right? And if you don't understand that as a part of your analysis of racial capitalism and the importance of resource distribution in this country, then that's where we have issues. But beyond that, it's like racial capitalism. Like, we just got to understand how these things are integrated, and also how the state and capital will also try to, mess with that and take advantage of these different, like, ideas to pit us against each other.
I just make another plug for this book. It's got a wonderful section in it, actually, on what you were just alluding to, the what the Bolshevik Revolution taught about the place of the national question and how intertwined the fight against national oppression is with the fight for of the working class for power, with a concrete application to, in the United States, it connects to the biggest national question in the United States is the oppression of African Americans. But the national question comes up in different forms all over the world. So there's a wonderful part in there. I'm still not sure I entirely understand the question, but I would reiterate, I think there is a lot of the left that is within the Democratic Party, and a lot of the debates on the left play out in one form or another. Like, for instance, somebody earlier, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders and the DSA are deep into the Democratic Party and have the idea, which is very harmful to the working class, that you can somehow turn the Democratic Party into something that it's not. So, a lot of the, debates of the left play themselves out within the Democratic Party today. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I think if you asked me that question 4 more times, I still wouldn't quite get it. So I'll leave it there.
We take the last hands here.
Sure. Yeah, we're rapidly approaching the 2-hour mark, so if we could just get these 2 questions together, and maybe you guys could answer them in the same time if possible.
Okay. So, my name is Imani.
Can you speak up?
Oh yeah. My name is Imani. I was just gonna ask, given this current moment of democratic backsliding that we're seeing in the U.S. And the very rapid polarization of the right, how do you feel that affects our efforts in regards to socialist revolution and abolition?
Well, I wanted to say, I think rather than keep your eye on the Democratic Party and what groups from the left, which are in the Democratic Party, are discussing, it's much more important to keep your eye on what the working class is doing. There's no strike wave in this country right now, but there are some important labor struggles. During the pandemic, there was a wave of nurses' strikes, despite the fact that they were painted as evil people who, how could you strike when there's a pandemic, a COVID pandemic? And they were one of their slogans was, they called us heroes. What was it?
And they treat us as
and
zeros.
They treat us like zeros. It demanded wage increases. They demanded a better proportion of nurses to patients for safety's sake, not just theirs, but for the patients as well. They demanded better hours instead of 12-hour continuous shifts, which burnt them out, a decent schedule. Well, that was during the pandemic. Today, there are 1,100 coal miners, underground coal miners in Alabama on strike. They've been on strike for 1.5 years, and they're not just fighting the company, Met Coal, but they're also fighting the National Labor Relations Act, which is in the company's back pocket. There are bakery workers. I'm a bakery worker at Alpha Baking here in Chicago, a big factory, and they have that union has waged fights that have won significant measures at Kellogg's, at Nabisco. You might remember the Nabisco strike on the west side, at Corn Nuts in California, which just concluded their strike, and solidarity activities at Ingredion in Cedar Rapids, a very small town in Iowa, and solidarity activities, that workers are carrying out, like the workers in my plant, through the union to raise funds and win solidarity for these union fights are very important. So I would encourage you to look at that, not the Democratic Party and not the organizations of the left. And then I think you'll get a better picture of what the possibilities are, because it's true, imperialism is very strong. And and nuclear weapons could destroy us if they are driven to that. But that just means that we have to organize ourselves now. And what we do now is going to give workers a chance at taking political power. That's the important thing, I think, to keep our eye on, not what the Democrats are saying. And the same thing goes with George Floyd. There was no dual power at any point, in my opinion, during the George Floyd protests. There was dual power for a couple of years in Cuba, where they set up 400 schools. The rebel army set up 400 schools and medical clinics in the mountains and areas that they controlled, where they had beaten the Batista forces before the revolution even happened. And that is the kind of thing that we have to look forward to. And in the meanwhile, yes, we'll see a lot of worker solidarity. Whenever there's a hurricane, workers come, the Cajun Navy is an example. Workers put themselves forward in New Orleans and Mississippi, Texas, everywhere, north, south, wherever the Dakotas. So anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Keep your eye on the workers.
There was another hand over here.
I feel like it would be too long of an answer, but for Timmy, I was mostly interested in your work with children and how that has shaped up. And I also wanted to point out that all four of you have, an idealistic mindset. You all have hope, and we all have hope for the future. And I think that's why I wanted to ask the question about kids and how that works out. So I don't know if that would be too long, but
yeah, so I'll make my comment and try to respond quick, and then I have to leave for another obligation. But I appreciate all the information you shared. I do think it's worth, in terms of the backsliding and the rise of the right, for me, some important implications is that, one, in response to the rise of the right, I think we're already seeing it is re-entrenchment of the neoliberal status quo, expansion of the carceral apparatus, liberals supporting further criminalization and policing imprisonment, right? So that's happening. But then you also, so we have to resist that and call that out as actually the neoliberal status quo is white supremacist fascism, right? And just it looks different than January 6th at one moment in time, right? And that needs to be militantly called out and opposed. Second is, for me, and at least from what I have not worked organized in unions and stuff, but I do have lots of comrades and friends who have, mostly people of color, and I have heard stories, a lot of experiences of young organizers talking about already racism within the labor movement of the left, right? So I think as the right of and so I've also seen as the right has increased, right? I've seen segments of the left trying to make appeals to racism and we just need to, but they're workers, right? And all this, as opposed to, yes, class is happening right now, and this is risking further white supremacy and deepening and racist, and needs to be called out, militantly called out as well. And I think that needs to be named and called out, at least within the left and among each other, and not kind of making excuses or appeals to white nationalism just because they're fucking workers. And so those are a couple of indicators of that. To the question around youth, yeah, so I work with a lot of young people, and they give me the most hope in terms of where their folks are at politically, and also engaging with ideological struggle with one another. Many things, I think, many because of the development of the internet and social media and all these things, access to political education, it's we're in a cyclone in terms of the political educating happening among youth and young people, which has its really scary threats, but also really amazing possibilities in terms of where young folks are at in their demands and understanding and analysis, and also what they're ready to fight for. So, and that gives me hope and, if anything, more energy to fight climate change, because we messed that up. And I'm saying we as in so many generations of people. Yeah, I have lots of hope in terms of like the analysis, understanding, and commitment to practice and organizing and like really trying to, make history. So, yeah. And thank you for having me. I have to run. Yeah.
Good seeing you, Tim.
Thank you.
So, sorry to spring this on you all, but if we could just, in your responses to the questions, just lead into any final remarks you have, and then we can conclude the panel.
Oh, okay. Well, just in response to the question in the back here, the Democratic Party backsliding, the effect on building not just socialism, but our movements in generally and so forth. I mean, I think we've been down this road many a times before in this time of year in the election cycle. And what we're seeing really this year is you got January 6th and Proud Boys. We're all you got. You got no place else to go. Okay? And that's the Democratic Party response. It's, we're going to give you pretty much the same old shit that we've been giving for the last several decades, or you can have the Proud Boys. That's your choices. Boy, I wonder why the electorate is not like super enthused in the Democratic base right now, and why they're losing out to the Republicans, who are motivated to, make America great again, or whatever the fuck they call it. To the extent that the left depends on the Democrats, we weaken ourselves. That has been shown over and over again. That's why.
Real quickly, I would say like Democratic backsliding, as in like the push of the Republican Party towards authoritarianism and potentially like getting rid of our democracy, more so on that side.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when the Democrats frankly screw working class people, decade after decade. There's a great book called How We Lost Wisconsin, which I strongly recommend. I picked it up on a lark a few years ago, but it's about the decades worth of Democratic Party promises to unions and others about, we're going to do something about the failings of the family farm, blah blah blah. We're going to do something about the loss of union jobs. We're going to end NAFTA. We're going to bring in card check. All the promises that the Democrats have been making literally for decades, and the statements of union activists saying, my own members who generally would support me and respect me, and then they see what these yahoos do when they get into office, or they stay into office over and over again, and get betrayed over and over again. So again, if the choice is between the pre-Trump status quo, it's and the Proud Boys, yahoos, and so forth. I mean, it's scary. I mean, what's happening to the Voting Rights Act right now? Basically the destruction of one of the central pillars of the early 1960s civil rights movement. There has been a decades-long war on all the gains of the late 60s, 1970s. And the Supreme Court, if you think the last term wasn't bad enough, not only do we have that, we have something called 303 Creative versus Elenis, which basically, if the court gets its way, and it seems very probable that they will basically say that LGBTQ people will not have equal access to public accommodations. Well, LGBTQ people are not a protected class in the Supreme Court's, rulings so far. But if you take away equal access to public accommodations for one group, then it's at risk for all groups. That was another big pillar of the early 1960s civil rights movement. But then you look at how we got this court. It was none other than Senator Biden who oversaw the hearings that slammed Anita Hill and brought us Clarence Thomas. I mean, this has been a bipartisan attack on working class living standards. And every time the Democrats thought they were going to lose an election, they moved to the right. I mean, that was Bill Clinton's, ending welfare as we know it, bringing, the Defense of Marriage Act and other things like that. And they voted for the Hyde Amendment in terms of limiting abortion rights for poor and black women. I mean, this is something that they have acceded to over and over again, moving the whole train of American politics to the right over the past 4 decades, to the point where now the Republicans, so as to distinguish themselves, go even further to the right, flirting with neo-fascism. But it's been a bipartisan move. Every single frickin' election cycle over the last half century has, the terms of the debate have moved further and further to the right, and the Democrats have been part of that. So yeah, it's totally scary what's happening in terms of election denialists and the lack of voting rights, voting rights being under the gun. But the Democrats aren't going to save us from this. That's a sad reality.
Well, I'll really point, I made my initial presentation. I think the main line of attack today against democratic and constitutional rights is coming from the left. You see it in the refurbishing of the FBI to go after whoever you want. They go after Trump, and they trample on, against unreasonable search and seizure. At the same time, they also then go after a couple small black nationalist organizations for their political stance vis-a-vis Russia and start trying to accuse them of being foreign agents, or they go after a Cuba Solidarity group in Puerto Rico. But they're trying to refurbish the FBI. It's a problem when the President of the United States gets up and says tens of millions of people who considered Trump to be the lesser evil in the last election are a clear and present danger, which is the language that they use to justify closing down First Amendment rights. That actual phrase in American legal politics dates back to the justification during after World War I for putting their opponents in jail for free speech, like Eugene Debs. You've seen for decades now, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, a growth in law being made by the Supreme Court or by the courts as opposed to the legislature, and law being made by the executive. Neither one of those is in the interests of working class. And the U.S. Constitution is a bourgeois constitution. It upholds bourgeois rule. At the same time, it incorporates in it a lot of protections in the Bill of Rights and some other things. Some protection of rule of law and stuff that is an improvement over them arbitrarily carrying things out like they did under the Kings and so forth. That are things that we should defend those rights to defend the space that working people need to have discussion, debate. We're against closing down debate with those you disagree with by saying, well, you're a racist, so I don't want to talk to you, or there's no place for this or that point of view to be discussed and debated out. So I think those questions they're very important to the working class today. We're a long way from having the kind of leadership or movement that's capable of taking power, and we need to defend these rights along the road to that. So that's I'll just close with those points.
I agree that the main attack on workers' liberal democratic rights is coming from the left at this moment. That's not to say Republicans come into power, that it won't be from the right later on. And I also don't think we should identify working class people by which bourgeois party they side with in elections that one time. Working class people are working class people, and they have the same interests, fundamentally. The low levels of consciousness creates these kinds of, low levels of class consciousness creates other kinds of consciousnesses that throw them off course. And that's where we meet them, try to move away from, say, whatever false consciousness, whatever misconceived ideas, toward class consciousness, right? And that's the role of the vanguard. We've had the opportunity, for whatever reason, to indulge ourselves in theory, to have partake in debates like this. And then other workers can't. Not everyone has the opportunity to go through all of this, right? And so that's our role. That's our duty. Now, just to final words on the subject that we came here for tonight. Essentially, my argument was that the only true abolitionism is communism, right? And I think I was surprised how both my remaining panelists agreed with that, more or less. Then tactically, before then, maybe some disagreements. So, yeah, I was just kind of surprised how redundant I felt when I was giving my speech. But now I guess since this is the closing remarks, I won't let this go without comment. One of the panelists made a point about Iran and this so-called murder by the morality police. There is CCTV evidence going around, confirmed, and she's walking more or less through chairs like this and falls over. That's it. Right? It's not a murder. And then we talk about the role of NGOs, for example. Well, in Iran, can you imagine? And so we have like the Meike, the Mujahideen Khalq, various other National Endowment for Democracy, CIA-related organizations. And I think this comes to one of the divides in the left between Trotskyites and Marxist-Leninists, where Trotskyites don't quite have this conception of imperialism in the same way. We talk about the national question, we talk about anti-imperialism. It's always about workers' revolution in the anti-imperialist country. But we need to see this in a kind of a dialectical way, right? They need sovereignty before they can have a revolution. You can't have a revolution when you're completely sock puppet state of the United States empire, which is what would happen if the Iranian regime fell. Not that I support everything about the Iranian regime, but we see that it is more or less independent, or codependent, say, with other countries, but it's not the Shah's regime.
All right.
I just wanted to say really quickly, the only constitutional danger, like the only group that has a constitutional danger at the moment is the right. Like I don't really see how the left is really opposing these things. Like, is there an effort on the left to prevent the discussion of certain ideas? Yes. However, I would definitely argue this isn't like a limitation of free speech. We're just saying we don't want fascist, racist, homophobic, authoritarian ideas to be allowed to be spread, because that is what is occurring, and it is, being seen through the very, very fast radicalization of the right. So this isn't really like a danger. This is, hey, we just want people's civil rights to be respected, and then the right is like, actually no, we don't want you guys to have civil rights. So I don't really see how we could say the left poses a danger to our constitutional rights as opposed to the right, which is kind of their entire political platform of suppressing non-white Christian men.
Well, and who defines what are the unacceptable or acceptable ideas?
I'd say the masses, and most people think,
That's
that
you start
racism is
giving
bad.
that power as opposed to answering those you disagree with. You've seen in the last, in the month since the Supreme Court, the draft Supreme Court Dobbs ruling was leaked, you've seen literally dozens of firebombings of anti-abortion clinics. Our party's been part of the fight to decriminalize abortion from, and stands on that ground. But you start, and we're part of defending the clinics against rightist attacks and so forth, abortion clinics. But you start justifying that, and it's justifying graffiti, Jane's revenge, abortions aren't safe, neither are you, and so forth, as opposed to answer, debate those who you disagree with. We have to
You can't
fight out.
debate
We
people
have
who
to.
want to kill us.
No,
That's
we have to fight. There's millions and millions, tens of millions of workers in this country who are convinced that abortion is murder, and so forth. But can be open to a real discussion and debate, which has to take place now, about why, decriminalization of abortion is part of the fight for women's, emancipation, and in the interest of the whole working class. But you're not going to win a debate by simply shutting people down. And we need that space for us. If we allow it to be shut down for those we disagree with, it does come back and rebounds ultimately against us. Those are attacks on freedom of speech, and that's exactly the point I was getting at.
Well, my thing is, so currently right now, like Republicans are trying to make it illegal for trans people to like be trans. You can't debate them out of that position. You're not going to debate a transphobe or a transphobe who thinks we should like murder like trans people and people who support trans. There are people literally like, oh, we're gonna bomb like hospitals that like offer gender affirming care to trans kids, right? Like this isn't like a debating thing. And once again, like we're not debating human rights. This isn't a thing we debate. You have your human rights. You have the right to exist. Okay, there are people in this country, a lot of people unfortunately, who don't want certain people to exist. And this isn't a thing that is like, oh, we should debate. Like, we shouldn't just let spread transphobic ideology on there. Like, this isn't a thing. Obviously, there is, in a democracy, which is what I hope to keep and Republicans are trying to get rid of, there is a need for political pluralism. This is the kind of the whole point of democracy. Like, we have disagreements, but we debate. We vote, and there is a balance between power and this political struggle to see who wins. But at the end of the day, we tolerate one another. However, the right has become increasingly intolerant, and they are more and more willing to kill like all of us. So this isn't a thing that we can just say, oh, freedom of speech, and we just let white nationalists just take over everything because we don't stop them from spreading these ideas. So that is all.
All right, so I'll just give you guys just 2 more minutes each, panelist, if you'd like to respond, then we'll wrap it up.
Where do we spend the vast majority of our waking lives? In the workplace. So should a racist be able to come in and spew all sorts of shit, creating what's known under the law, and I think rightfully so, is creating a hostile workplace? I mean, the right would argue that that's free speech. I should be able to spout my racist shit, my homophobic shit, my sexist shit, or whatever. Now, I think most people here would agree that's creating a hostile workplace. Take it out of the workplace. Someone on the L spewing racist shit at someone or harassing a woman just verbally. It's just free speech. I mean, there's more nuances to this question. And when you bring up the fake, reproductive clinics, I mean, the fact is that those clinics are basically performing medical malpractice. Now, there has been a move in many states in this country to shut down so-called reparative therapy clinics that target LGBTQs for their medical malpractice. I think, frankly, if we lived in a science-based society, these phony clinics that tell people that abortion is more dangerous than carrying a fetus to term and bullshit like that, they should be shut down for medical malpractice. The fact that this country allows that kind of crap to continue, people get frustrated. And so they might put "We Are Jane" or whatever on them and so forth. But I think it pales by comparison to the level of harassment and violence committed by the right against abortion clinics and the murders of doctors and other clinic staff. I think to equate them, I think, is absurd.
A lot of times the word fascist gets thrown around as an epithet, including, Trump, Biden calling MAGA Republicans semi-fascist, and using it as basically a justification that then you don't discuss or debate out what your views are. It's an idea it's used both to justify vote for the lesser evil Democrats, and it's used to justify violent attacks that shut down space. I'm sorry, there have been attacks both from the right and the left. You look at what, the assault that just happened on Paul Pelosi, and all the media coverage of it in the liberal media is comparing it to what you saw on January 6th. I have not seen, and I could have missed it, but I certainly have not seen in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, or anywhere else, reference to the person who was arrested outside Brett Kavanaugh's house with zip ties, duct tape, and stated he was planning to murder Brett Kavanaugh. A very similar kind of thing to what happened at Pelosi House, both completely unacceptable, things that we're against, that kind of political violence. But yes, it is coming from both the right and the left, you know. Completely forgotten is the Bernie Sanders supporter who shot up the Republican baseball game. The only thing that's going to put a stop to this is, you know, the ruling class will turn to real fascism when it needs to put down a rising workers' movement. And the force that can stop that is the working class organized. We're for, you know, the union, and there's examples of this, you know, especially good example in the 1930s, you know, that the Teamsters in Minneapolis organized when they were threatened by a fascist gang, where they organized a workers' defense guard through the union to, you know, of people that were, you know, experienced from the picket line battles. And they actually ran the Silver Shirts out of Minneapolis, which is a fascist gang at that point. But that's where the real defense against fascism is going to come from. But to do that, we need the space for discussion and debate. And no, there's a difference between harassment and freedom of speech. You're saying you're for not allowing things to be discussed and debated on the internet. No, people got a right to discuss and debate on the internet. There's a lot of, if you spend most of your time looking at social media on the internet, you're going to be lost for getting anything productive done anyway. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, my thing is, like, in response to the
sorry,
threats
I have to cut
of,
you off.
I'm sorry, I gotta say, in response to the threats of, like, SCOTUS members being assassinated, like, collectively, Congress is just like, okay, we need to increase protection for Supreme Court justices, and that's what happened. Like, Paul Pelosi was nearly beaten to death, and the right is just like, it was a false flag event. This was his gay lover that he got caught with. Like, the right has no problem with our political leaders being killed. In fact, they want them to be killed. They want assassinations to start occurring. Whereas we who support democracy are just like, maybe let's not kill political leaders. There's a broad support for people to, like, keep this sense of democracy and semi-peace that we live in. That is, there's a presence on the left and the center that is not real on the right. Like, it's just not even close. Like, the right is the problem in this country. Period.
All right, thank you. Any last comment?
To the last questioner's idea of human rights. Human rights is fundamentally idealist and ahistoric. There are no human rights that have existed throughout history. Rather, it's rights within class society. It's conditioned by material conditions, right? And so, like, there are the rights of the ruling class, and there are the rights of the oppressed class. And so there's no, like, universal human values. There are no human rights. They can talk about these things in whatever idealist, flowery language they would like, but fundamentally, these things don't really exist. These are legal things on paper that you can decide to follow, and then when it becomes inconvenient, the dustbin's somewhere around here, right? That's what human rights stand for. So I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Thank you to all the panelists and the audience for the lively discussion tonight.